Hey guys, welcome back. So, this video is going to be an overview of Module 5 for Earth and Environmental Science. Now, if you did it last term for the first time and you're wanting to just clarify a few things or help you get up to speed after the holidays, have a quick watch of this video and have a crack at the questions that will be provided at the end. So, to start with, let's look at what we should have covered. Okay, so the origins of life on Earth was up for debate for a very long time because a lot of people were still operating under the concept of cell theory, which is that life must come from lifeless matter. So if that's the case, where did the first life begin? Now, the Urey-Miller experiment is something you might have covered in biology, whereby Doctors Urey and Miller tested to see whether the basic building blocks of life could have occurred in the natural circumstances of our planet. So as you can see in the diagram here, we have water vapor that's been heated up and it's been mixed with methane, ammonia, and hydrogen gas in the presence of an electrode. So this is meant to represent some of the key materials that were present, along with the energy requirements that were there. Now in doing so, it was also condensed. Afterwards, it chemically reacted using cold water here, and any organic material would have fallen out at this point, whereas the normal water would have continued onwards. Now at this point, we're also considering that there was a lot of water in, but also pumping in new water, or they might have put a filter there. Now, meteorites, according to these notes here, were also a very big portion of what helped create life because they provided unique materials that Earth didn't actually have. Remember, Earth is a spherical shape floating in space. Now, Earth will not gain or lose mass unless something actually makes it up and out of the atmosphere. Very lighter than air gases such as hydrogen gas or helium might naturally bleed off of our atmosphere. Also, any material that we launch into space, such as space shuttles or rockets that have payloads that go out into space, or satellites, are actually going to help our planet over time shed very minuscule amounts of matter. To contribute that, we have to have something coming from space to hit Earth, such as meteorites. Now, originally, they also thought that panspermic theory or panspermia was a possible theory whereby life traveled on a meteor from another planet, landed on Earth, and was like a seed. It started to grow. So that means that all life wasn't actually indigenous to Earth, but rather came from somewhere else. Now, over time, the Urey-Miller experiment became more of an accepted theory, as panspermic theory is incredibly unlikely. Consider how big space is. Okay, now also consider the circumstances that would allow life to end up on a meteor floating through space, and the odds of it landing on Earth. Occam's razor, which is the simplest answer, is often the most correct one, would state that the Urey-Miller experiment is much more likely, whereby we already had the materials here. It was just a matter of time for the right components to be combined together to create amino acids. Now, down the very bottom here, we also have some information about hydrothermal vents. Now, these hydrothermal vents were responsible for kicking up various materials that were found only beneath the crust into the bottom of the ocean. Now, some of these materials, such as black smokers and white smokers, were incredibly hot, and they also produced materials such as iron, copper sulfate, calcium, and barium sulfate. While some of them are crucial to life, the sheer temperature around it doesn't actually make it likely that life could survive there. Extremophiles today can survive, but not necessarily those. Whereas an alkaline hydrothermal vent was only 60 degrees. Hot, but not unbelievably hot, and produced tons of materials. So these alkaline ones would more likely than not help with creating the building blocks for life. Now, photosynthetic life came a little bit later on. Now, here we have what's known as a stromatolite. Stromatolites are essentially a pillar of layered bits of organic matter and growth that's been growing over time. So, as we can see, the top of the head is what we call supratidal, which means it's often above tidal flows. Now these things only occur in areas where the tide comes in and then recedes back out. So these stromatolites are estimated to be 3.4 to 3.5 billion years old, and each one of these layers has crucial information about conditions that might have occurred during those 3.5 billion years. Now, the terms here, supratidal, intertidal, and subtidal, refer to whether it was above, semi-above, semi-below, or below water currents that came through. Okay? Now, over time, each layer of these stromatolites had excreted matter coming out the top. So on the very top, we had microbes, or photosynthetic microbial activity, or colonies. These colonies would produce waste that they would shove underneath them. And as such, over time, they would build up a layer. Then the rest of the microbes would grow on top of that, and then create more waste. So it's like it was building a ladder as it was climbing it. Now, what makes this unique is that because these stromatolites were photosynthetic, they could dictate how much energy they need in order to produce how much waste. So it stands to reason that if we know how much sunlight was reaching them, we could estimate aspects of the atmosphere and how much other material was present, such as carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and water in the atmosphere. So Cyanobacterium is essentially like a full cell that served as a chloroplast. To give you in layman's terms, imagine a Cyanobacterium as one of the oldest computers that you've ever seen. Okay, it's big, it's boxy, it takes up a whole desk. Now, a current chloroplast is like your iPhone. It's smaller, but it's much more advanced, it's much more efficient. Now, over time, these stromatolites and the Cyanobacterium were major contributors into helping oxygen reach into atmosphere, and it's a really important aspect. So, the Cyanobacterium helps to alter this composition of our atmosphere. So in the very early days, so 4.6 to let's say around about here, we had huge amounts of methane, water, hydrogen, helium gas, and carbon dioxide. But with the presence of Cyanobacterium and stromatolites that they grew on, we can see there was a dramatic change because carbon dioxide and water are both used in photosynthesis. So if life started taking all this material from the atmosphere, then those levels are going to go down. But in turn, what happened was we had an increase in oxygen. We call these oxidation events, or OE, and these are crucial because they allowed our atmosphere to sustain organisms like us. If we were to go back 3.5 to 4 billion years ago, we need to have a specialized suit in order to breathe properly, because we couldn't breathe the natural air that's there. Now on this graph we can see the amount of oxygen that's formed in the atmosphere. We can see that it goes up and down based on events that occurred on our planet. So around about 600 to 800 million years ago we had a Neoproterozoic oxidation event. So this is associated with global cooling. Now if we know that creating huge amounts of CO2 in our atmosphere causes the atmosphere to increase in temperature, then it stands to reason then if CO2 levels go down but oxygen goes up, then it creates a global cooling event. And this has resulted in a natural cycle of global warming and global cooling, which has remained undisturbed for a long period of time until humans started developing new forms of technology. Now, here we have a modern microbialites, which is post-Cyanobacterium. So after Cyanobacterium began to develop, we can see that there's a huge increase in oxygen. Now eventually, Cyanobacterium would be outsourced by other forms of bacterium, such as eukaryotic algae, and then eventually development of plants, which is much later here. With the first dinosaurs, we can see there's a small decrease in oxygen because they're consuming it. So Multicellular organisms are a big deal because back in the day when we had, say, your cyanobacterium, whoops, here, a lot of the earliest forms of organic life were very simple. Okay, they were not designed to be incredibly complex or articulated. They were simply, it works, don't change it. But due to the sheer numbers, they started to change conditions. So in turn, life had to change as well. The first evidence of a multicellular organism is actually a plant called a Bangis morpha, approximately 1200 million years ago. Now, eventually animals began to form when we started having CO2 decrease and O2 level increase to the point of which it could sustain us. Now, a big term down here is bilaterally symmetrical animals. Recognized today, diversified and became well established. So, bilaterally symmetrical means that if I were to split an animal down the center and look at either side, they will be relatively the same. There are very few animals where you cannot do this with. Okay? So, say for instance that you have a horse. One side of the horse is not going to be musclier than the other side of the horse. Okay? There has to be at least one axis where if you cut it in half, each side would be relatively similar. Now this means that it was an advantageous trait, much like how the pentadactyl limb is a trait that was very advantageous. If both sides are symmetrical, then it means that they can go in a straight line, and they're not going to be compromised. They're not going to start going around in a circle because one side's super muscly and the other side's really weak. Okay? Or they're not going to be disadvantaged, like both eyes are on the left-hand side of the head. Makes no sense because you have a massive blind spot here. Around about 523 million years ago, some animals, when they achieved larger sizes, began an evolutionary arms race. They started developing armor, teeth, and eyes, and at which point this predator-prey relationship actually started to kick off. Before then, every organism was just struggling to survive. But 523 million years ago, they were so good at surviving that they started to compete with each other over natural resources. Alright, so in here we start to look at some really old pieces of evidence. So plants, 470 million years ago, arthropods, 414 million years ago, tetrapods, 365 million years ago. Evidence suggests that they evolved from aquatic species and gradually transitioned to land, taking 2 to 10 million years. The reason why it took so long is because inside an ocean, most of the abiotic factors such as temperature and access to oxygen was relatively stable. On land, they could fluctuate wildly. For instance, if you go into the desert, it can drop down to minus 15 at night. During the day, early 40s. So it's a great range. Inside of the ocean, around about 20 to 30 degrees. Really, really stable. The plant colonization of terrestrial environments during the Devonian period assisted in stabilizing soil by root anchoring to bedrock, stabilizing soil profiles which enabled thicker profiles to form. So before then, you had really exposed, parent material and not many horizons. Now, when you started having roots attaching, they were able to help break down more of the parent material, and the regolith that formed just stayed where it was. So it started building on top of it. Okay? So after the Devonian period, we actually started having soil that could not just be a result of weathering, but contribute to plants being able to survive longer. This helped in reducing erosion rates with the soil profile, with the roots involved. They could increase more parent material to be weathered to create more soil and minimize eroding factors. So it was less likely the soil was just going to get washed away and wasted. Now here we have land organisms. So I'll just move this over here. Up the top here we have the Cambrian period, which is the earliest form. And as we go down to the Ordovician, Silurian, Carboniferous, Devonian, and Permian periods, we can see that if you read the traits, that they become more complex over time. So in the Cambrian period, many of the primitive animals were just sponges. But as we go down, they start to develop bones, they start to develop articulated limbs, they start to have massive deposits turned to coal. That's beneficial for us as humans, obviously. But they start to develop amphibians, which would colonize on land around about the Carboniferous period, like the first fish that came out of water. It might have been a lungfish or something similar. Now, eventually get down to the Permian period. Here we had organisms that could withstand extreme temperature variations, and they are able to, consume other matter in order to feed themselves, and they could retain any water they got from the food they ate. So here they say that plants had waxy leaves, animals had leathery skin. It made it more difficult to lose water due to transpiration or sweating. Over here, we can see that a lot of the organisms that started out might have been based around salt water because they started in the ocean. But then over time, they started to develop in fresh water. Then in areas where they had high amounts of sunlight. Then they had something that could sustain itself during drought. And then finally, you had things that were only based on land. Alright, now the evolution of the biosphere. So our biosphere evolved over time. It started off with a lot of organisms that were similar, and then the number of variations of species, the number of different types of plants and bacteria and fungi and animals exploded in what became known as the Cambrian explosion. So here we can see there's a relationship between our geosphere and the biosphere over a long period of time. So when the early oceans began to form, we started having proto-organisms. When we had very little to no free oxygen, most life actually formed and only lived in the oceans. But over time, when the oxidation event occurred, we started having more variation of plants and animals that could survive on land. Now, here in this table, we have different areas of sea, first plant animal, first land plants, Devonian, and then finally living plant animals, and what kind of materials they required in order to survive. So, Cambrian green algae often required brackish water, which means it's a combination of fresh and salt water. So any sort of estuary or a delta or a mangrove swamp that's located on the coast is where most of this would survive, that sort of region, but not with the amount of protection that those mangrove swamps and trees and plants and everything provided. Alright. Tectonic supercycle. Now, in junior school, when you looked at continental drift, you would have become familiar with Pangaea, or Pangea. Different ways of pronouncing it, all of them are the same. As long as you spell it right, it's all good. Now, this occurred in the Permian period around 250 million years ago, and it was part of what became known as a plate tectonic supercycle, where in essence, all of these different continents would constantly drift around and merge, then split apart, and then merge again, very, very slowly. Other supercontinents that might have existed before them include Pannotia, Rodinia, Columbia, and Canaland. The Pangaea one is famous because it would have been the period where dinosaurs were roaming the Earth 250 million years ago, and as such, a lot of the earlier fossils that we found, dinosaur bones, would have indicated that Pangaea actually existed. So we can see here that Pangaea split up into Laurasia and Gondwanaland for us in Australia. So Gondwanaland was where Australia was located. Now during the Jurassic period, we can see it splits even further. So we have Australia over here, and it's splitting off from Antarctica. Antarctica moved further south. Australia moved out away from the others. And as such, we started developing our own unique biosphere because we, as Australia, are primarily cut off from a lot of other continents. Now, because we're cut off from these continents, most of our plants and animals were evolving and changing undisturbed from other factors. If you go into Asia, Europe, and North America, they will have some variation of bear, or they might have something like a tiger, Like if you compared, say, India, Asia, and South Africa. Oh, sorry, Africa, not South Africa. All of them had very large cats. Australia doesn't. So, evolution, climate, and the supercycle. So here we can see that the plate tectonic supercycle was capable of affecting other factors as well. So let's say you had one massive supercontinent. In doing so, you have less exposed coastline compared to if you have multiple continents. Because of this, there was more sea, or there's more ocean exposed to the surface. So the sea level was at its minimum. It was lower. However, if you broke it apart and there was more coastline, waters would rush in and it would increase because there was more land taking up more space. The climate decreases when supercontinents form due to marine sediments absorbing CO2 and polar ice sheets reflecting solar radiation. So if we wanted to snap our fingers and solve climate change, maybe we could make another supercontinent by just slamming it back altogether. Basalt production. Rifting causes CO2 release and greenhouse conditions. Basalt is often a result of seafloor spreading. So two plates split apart, magma comes up through, cools when it reaches seawater, forms basalt. Then they move apart again, cracks, forms more. Evolutionary events linked to supercontinent formation include proliferation of cyanobacteria, appearance of metazoans, and evolution of skeletons. And supercontinent drifting creates new habitats and leads to adaptive radiation of species. Adaptive radiation means that when you have a species and begins to create much more variation, okay, it spreads out the differentiation of all individuals within a single species so that there's more likely a chance that a small percentage of that species will survive and then pass on their genes and help that species evolve overall. So here we can see the general process. So we start with something that's relatively stable. We have a sag basin, can form a rift basin. So we have material that's heating up underneath. Young passive margin. It's passive mature margin, oceanic subduction. So essentially, if they're moving apart, imagine separating hot dough. Okay? If we're pulling it apart, it thins at the center, and then eventually it will begin to drift apart to the point at which it splits. Alright. Fossil formation. Now, there are different types of fossils based on what kind of conditions are present, what type of animal or plant or whatever there was. So, for the most part, fossil formation only occurred in sedimentary rock because it had the conditions there to preserve them. Metamorphic and igneous are exposed to such heat and pressure that it will destroy organic material in there and distort it. Now, for the most part, if they're condensed and there's other materials there that don't help preserve it, it results in creating what we call fossil fuels. But let's say, for instance, that we want a perfectly preserved fossil. There are at least 6 different variations. We'll have a quick look at them. We have trace fossils, which include stuff like footprints, burrows, anything that indicate that an animal was there. Mold and casts, so it could be an impression of something, so it might have died. The animal, laid down in a mud pit, passed away over millions of years. The animal didn't survive, its remains didn't survive, they were destroyed, but the impression that it left in the stone underneath, it survived. A replacement is where the organic material, the original material of an animal, is slowly being substituted with something that's inorganic. So imagine a skeleton that has slowly been taken over by inorganic crystals that form inside it, but it retains the original shape. Petrified or permineralized. Empty pore spaces are filled with minerals such as petrified wood. Amber. It's very similar to, say, original material, except it's much more specified in the fact that it's preserved in ancient tree sap. Mummification or freezing, similar, But over time, that one is more likely to suffer from degrading. So if we have, say, a mummy, if it were to be rehydrated and then desiccated again, it will be severely warped and damaged. Much like if you froze something, and then thawed it, and then froze it again, it would become more damaged over time. Same reason you don't thaw something from your freezer and then refreeze it again, because odds are it'll be altered after it's been thawed out. Now, rapid burial is crucial as it helps provide an anorexic environment. Exposure to air is one of the most damaging things that can happen to fossils and remains like these. So if it's been entombed in something like tar or amber or ice or tree sap or volcanic ash, it does really well. I mean, look at Pompeii. We have stuff there that's been perfectly preserved for thousands of years, a couple of thousand years. If it's embedded in sediment, then there's a chance the material can undergo petrification when liquefaction occurs on the surrounding soil horizon. So if it was, say, stuck in, say, mud, and then over time that mud was beginning to turn into stone through petrification, then that can alter the fossil itself. Alright. Index fossils. Now, let's say that you've dug approximately 10 meters down. Now, when you've dug that far down, you found a particular seashell. This seashell might only be found at this particular depth because that is when, according to the law of superposition, it died and was starting to be buried into, layer upon layer of sediment soil. Now, index fossils are known for having a very distinctive start point and end point, and they only occur within that range. So this means before that time period, before their start point, they didn't exist as a species. After their end point, they were all extinct, there was no more left. Now, if we know a very narrow band for this index fossil, and we compare it to another fossil, we can say this did not occur at the same time as that, or these both occurred at the same point in history, because that index fossil would have been dated very thoroughly, so we know exactly at what time period it actually existed. Then from there, we might be able to say it was 2 centimeters longer than this one, so that might mean it was a couple of 100,000 years beforehand. Now, they do serve as very good benchmarks. However, index fossils are very great as relative dating, which means they're not going to be super accurate. If you're comparing something to an index fossil, it's a great ballpark figure, but then you go on to doing, actual dating. Right, dating fossils. Now, there are two terms that people often use when they're looking at fossils. One, the present is the key to the past. So what we know now, comparing it to what happened then. Okay, we can use what evidence we have currently with us today to help unravel past events. Okay. A lot of paleontologists, a lot of geophysicists, a lot of people who study all of these ancient samples will use current evidence and understanding of how things operate to reconstruct how things happened a long time ago. And from there, we have the second phrase, the past is the key to the future. If I threw my keys to you right now, and someone took a photo of it, as they were directly in the center of the arc, these keys are the present. I understand that they can't move on their own and they need a form of propulsion. So I can extrapolate backwards to me with my outstretched hand after I've just thrown them, indicating that, oh, he must have used his hand to provide propulsion to make them go into the air. That's the first statement. The second statement, the past is the key to the future. I know where my hand is. I know where the keys are. I know how gravity affects an object in flight. Ergo, I can predict where it's going to land. Very similar to Benoit Blanc's gravity's rainbow. Okay, we understand the logical progression of events, so we can predict what's going to happen next. Now, with this, we can combine aspects of stratigraphy, superposition, and uniformitarianism, so we can have an idea of where our current conditions will lead us. However, for the most part, throughout the Earth's history, they haven't experienced human interaction. So this might not be entirely accurate. So here we have some very important events. A geological boundary between the Phanerozoic and Cretaceous periods due to presence of radically different fossils before and after the boundary. The reason why this might be is because at the end of the Cretaceous period, we know there was a massive extinction level event. Okay, dinosaurs were wiped out. The Cretaceous, Paleogene, and Permian Triassic extinction events were documented thanks to stratigraphic positioning and radiocarbon dating of volcanic material. Anytime we had a massive supervolcano erupting, or we were able to have a meteor hit the Earth and it kicked up tons of ash and dirt and dust and soot and whatever, it would leave a very thin layer inside the stratigraphy of a given piece of earthen material. From there, we can determine whether something was after that event or before that event. The Cambrian explosion was dated due to sudden presence of sighted, shelled marine animals appear in the fossil records. Again, the explosion doesn't mean it was an actual explosion, but a rapid increase in the number of species of organisms present. So here, the number of sighted and shelled marine animals just went through the roof. So, according to statistics, it was an explosion. Towards the start of the Cambrian explosion, there was fossil evidence of large mammalian animals in sediment just adjacent to sterile sediment. So, beforehand, there was nothing in that sediment. There was no sign of life. Afterwards, lots of it. So, if you're comparing a campfire to explosions, a campfire gradually uses fuel, okay, and it slowly burns over a long period of time. An explosion rapidly uses fuel in a very short instance. So here, the number of organisms rapidly expanded compared to just gradually expanded. Zircon dating of volcanic crystals adjacent to Cambrian layer puts Cambrian explosion approximately 540 million years ago. Very important information to know about is the Cambrian explosion is one thing that's always brought up in stuff like this, in this particular topic. Alright, that's the end for the video for today. If you have a chance, what I'd like you to do is, along with the stuff that's covered in this video and the stuff that's in your own notes, have a crack at these 4 inquiry questions. Okay, these are the type of things that exams, particularly HSC exams and trial exams, are based around. Okay, if you cannot answer these questions and provide evidence to support your answers, then clearly you need to go back to these topics and re-examine them. Alright? So for each of these questions, there could be a complete discussion question, easily about 1 page. Alright? Have a crack at writing these. Alright? Ensure that you're using steel or peel paragraph structure. Ensure that you're able to, create a basic report style when you're doing this. And if you need to, go in and see your earth and environmental science teacher, or talk to someone else in your class and show them what you've written. If they have questions about it that you can't answer, that might be something to just jot down in a different colored pen on your piece of paper to help you out. Alright, as always, I've been Forry. You guys have been amazing. If you have any questions, please ensure to leave a comment in this video or any future requests, and I'll see you in the next film. Alright, peace.